Great. Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. So that actually saved me a few seconds of what I was going to say. First of all, this is joint research I'm doing with a was a former honors student of mine at the University of Sydney, uber smart mathematician economist. So what you're not going to see today is half of the research is a theoretical model. That was more of his contribution, I think, and I think for this audience, maybe not the appropriate thing to be giving here today. I wanted to thank the Science of Philanthropy Initiative, John Templeton, and all the various people who organized this conference. I think it's a great piece of work. Okay, so following up on what Dan just said, and also what John List said in his closing remarks just right after the end of lunch, which is, we study in a positive way why it is that people are doing philanthropic activities. And as in the introduction, the main stories we think about when economists look at philanthropy and charitable giving is both pure and impure motives. And just to be clear here, pure motives would be the compassion we receive for the improved welfare of others. And one of the important things to say with pure altruism is it doesn't matter who provides that benefit. Whether I give it, it's a government agency or somebody else. And so that's going to lead to a lot of these stark predictions about crowding out that we find fairly unrealistic. The alternative is in pure altruism. And in pure altruism, over the last 25 years has exploded in terms of the study of this and understanding of it. I'm actually not going to go into the details of the different stories, but you can think about these are all being generated through your contribution, the actions you take, whether giving money or time, and how that might affect you. Okay, and there's been a lot of empirical studies looking at trying to better identify these impure motives. The important part here for this presentation is going to be that charitable behavior, philanthropy is a combination of pure and impure motives. Okay, why should we identify this? Well, there's a science part to this. It would just be, it's good to understand the human condition. But I think also from a policy perspective, it's extremely important. It can inform governments on the best practices about how they should be involved or where and when they should be involved, and charitable organizations and how they run fundraising campaigns, which has been a theme of a number of talks here. Okay. Our research starts with the volunteering puzzle, one of these really stark issues about why pure altruism can't seem to explain behavior. The volunteering puzzle, very simply, is that we observe people that volunteer their time. So I go and work for a day with Habitat for Humanity, Soup Kitchen, pick your favorite choice. And alternatively, I could have just stayed in my office. I could have worked an extra day at the office. I could have generated money from that, and I could have donated that money to the charity. And the charity could have used that money to pay somebody else to do the labor I did. Probably could have paid 3 more people to do it. And so it seems like we're giving in a very inefficient way. And that's been generally understood to be the reason why this occurs, this inefficient giving, is because people are getting benefits out of the warm glow they're doing. It's not just the fact that they're helping others, the compassion they get. And what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to define a concept called the price of impurity. We're going to actually try and go out and very specifically measure what it is that the actual sort of numerical sense of this value of that warm glow. And to give you a heads up of the way what I'm going to do is we're going to do a lab experiment. And the key thing we're going to do in the lab experiment that we think is unique is we're going to manipulate the relative weights people give to pure and impure motives. Okay, that's going to be the core. If we fail to do that in the lab, we have nothing to say in this work. And then what we're going to do is we've got this exogenous shock, and we have some people now who are going to give greater weight to pure motives, some people to more impure motives. And now we're going to go through and look at sort of the standard issues. How does that affect overall values to charitable giving? We're going to look at the issue of crowding out based on government policies. We're also going to look at organizational policies, the one that we're going to look at matching with a lot of people have talked about. In those policies, in terms of the relative weights of pure and impure. And then we're also going to look at one other issue here, which we think is really important. It is basically, we think, almost not studied at all, which is are people substituting between money and time in terms of their charitable behavior. Okay. So our work starts, the theoretical stuff, you get one line, that's the top line here for the entire theory. We think of people, they're motivated by their income they receive, they're motivated by the pure motives of altruistic giving, and they're also motivated by impure motives of giving money and giving time. Our theoretical work is based also on a Jim Andreoni paper, one that was never published, but he worked on pretty extensively in the mid-1990s. And we did some extensions to that work. In the end, we solve and we figure out what people would optimally do based on the theoretical work, and we find how much money and how much time volunteering they would optimally choose to do. Okay, here is what I hope is very intuitive when I'm done with this. If you don't like the technical stuff here, is the definition of what we're going to call the price of impurity. Okay, we look at the optimal choice of how much time and money somebody gives. Okay, that's our G hat, H hat. That's the individual's optimal behavior. We look at the value that generates for the charity. That's the V term there. And we also look at how much it costs the individual in terms of how much money they gave up and the opportunity cost when they're volunteering that they could have been working, and what the after-tax values to them. Okay, and then we ask ourselves, well, there's lots of other ways they could have chosen to give money and time that would have produced the identical value to the charity. They could have just reallocated their use of their money and time. And what we're going to find is we're going to find the same allocation that produces the exact same value to the charity, but it's going to minimize their cost of giving, or it's going to maximize their income they could keep afterwards. Charity receives the exact same value, but they get higher income they get to keep for themselves. Okay? This difference, the cost that from the choices they make versus the cost they could have incurred to give the same value, that's going to be the cost of warm glow, the cost of impurity. And then we're just going to normalize it. Some people are giving a lot, some people are giving little. We're going to normalize it by the amount that they're giving. And this proportion is what we're going to call the price of warm glow. This is how much they could have additionally given to the charity for the exact same cost to themselves. And we're going to say this only can be attributed to warm glow. Okay, so that's kind of the core of the paper. Okay, so we're going to have this experiment. And in our experiment, people are going to be endowed, our subjects are going to be endowed with a fixed amount of money. They're going to be endowed with some time that they can choose to work for themselves or the charity. And they just have to make their decisions. The task we do in our charity, it's a real task in terms of both the work job that we ask them to do and for the charity. It's basically going to be identical. They're going to address stuff and fold envelopes. If they decide to work for themselves rather than the charity, they're going to earn a private wage. This is set by the organization we worked with. And then if they work for the charity, they're going to produce a value. This is the actual value to the charity. They went out, they priced how much it would cost to do the exact same work. And anything that was not done through our lab experiment, they finished this by paying 30 cents per unit of the task. The private organization we worked for was a small optometry firm that was doing a campaign to try and get people to come in for eye checkups. We worked with the charity. Their organization, they're fairly obscure, was to build primary schools in Uganda. And in the lab, we used pretty standard methods so they could verify that, in fact, every decision they made was going to actually really occurred. And we really did give the money to the charity and so forth. Okay, the main manipulation in this experiment, which is going to be to affect their pure versus impure motives, is going to be in a certificate we're going to give to them that's going to frame, in their perspective, what they're donating. So in the pure motive, we're going to basically giving them a certificate that tells them the value to the organization. And in the impure, we're going to focus their attention on the money and time they actually gave. Okay? I'm going to show you it's going to be a really subtle manipulation. It was one of these experiments we thought, gee, maybe we'd made too subtle a manipulation. We're going to get nothing. The second manipulation between subjects that we're going to do is we're going to do tax destination. So you can think of this as there's a tax. It gets collected by the government, and who knows what they do with it. And there's going to be a tax that gets collected, and we're telling them it's going to go entirely to the charitable organization. So that's our 2x2 design between subjects, and that's going to be essentially our core manipulations. This is the certificate. It's going to be the identical certificate up until the very last line, and the only thing that's going to vary is going to be you've given this amount of money, you've given this amount of time, or you've generated this value for the charity. Nothing else is going to differ in this experiment. Okay, and I'm going to show you it's even more subtle than this in a minute. That overstates how much of a manipulation that is. Within our session, subjects make 24 decisions, and we're going to vary their endowment, we're going to vary wages, we're going to vary the match, so the policy of the organization, we're going to vary the tax rate, the government policy here. They had 40 minutes to work, as I said. Okay. And then of these 24 decisions they make, we're going to choose one, and then that actually gets carried out, and they have to work for 40 minutes based on how they allocated their time, and we actually then take their money also, give them what they chose for themselves, and give the rest to the charity. In terms of the actual lab sitting in there, there's a lot of instructions. They learn about the charity, they learn about the optometry, so they sort of know everything. There's going to be 6 screens where they make the actual decisions. On each screen, then there's going to be 4 different choices, so we tell them the conditions. We then have them over here with these slider bars, and they just choose how much money they want to give. They just choose how much time they want to give. Whenever they're making a choice, they're moving these slider bars around. Whatever decision they're on, it's going to update information here and on the certificate. And what I mean by this being very subtle, this is changing. But over here, this would be identical between the treatments. It's not an information issue. The information in terms of what the charity receives and what they receive, they've got that in every case. So the only thing that's different is just how we frame this certificate. But in terms of information, there's no difference. We have these 6 screens. They could move back and forth, so they could go forward, they could go back. And in fact, we saw subjects moving around quite a bit and actually making these choices. OK, results. So our first thing I want to show you is that if we look at the amount of money that subjects gave and the amount of times that they donated to this charitable organization in our impure versus pure prime, and if we think of the impure as Jim Andreoni telling us that impure seems to be a very strong motive, what we're seeing is when we focus people's attention on the impure prime, they give both more money and they give more time. I won't show you this here today, but those would be significantly higher amounts. But we got to be cautious here, because this is in terms of what they're giving. But to our core manipulation, what we found is that it's coming at a cost. Okay, so in the impure case, even though we've been able to get them to give more money and more time, for every dollar they're giving, 21 cents of that is going straight to impure motives. That's not going to the charity. So they could have reallocated their budget, given the exact same amount, and they would have generated 21 extra cents for the charity. Whereas in our pure case, it's a smaller cost of impurity, smaller price of impurity. It's only 16%. And this is a 25% decrease in the inefficiency that's being made in the impure case going to the pure case. And it's statistically significant. We also show it's basically a full distribution shift. It's not there's a few subjects. The entire distribution is shifting in terms of this price of impurity through to the manipulation. OK, turning to government policy and turning to this question of crowding out when you have impure versus pure motives. What I'm going to show you over here in this left-hand side of the figure is that this is the amount of money that's being generated for the charity. And over here is the amount of money that was being given up by the subjects in terms of their money and time decisions. And if we start over here in the pure case, so what we're going to show you is the two framings, impure and pure. And we're going to show subjects, this is between subjects, in the regular tax versus in the light shaded bar, and in the dark shaded bar, the tax to the charity. What you see is in the pure frame, when we have the tax going to the charity, it's not generating any extra money. Right? This is essentially saying that we're seeing almost complete crowding out that's occurring. If you come over here and look at what's happening in terms of how much it costs for subjects to give money, you're seeing this crowding out. When we go from the regular tax to the tax to charity, when the subjects know their money is being, this alternative source of where the money is getting to the charity, they're actually giving up less. They're substituting away from their decisions to help the charity. On the other hand, if you look at the impure case, what you see is when the tax goes to the charity, it's going to the charity. And you don't see nearly as much, it's hard to say exactly here, but you see that that's generating more money for the charity. If you come over here and look at the actual decisions, it's not affecting at all how much cost they're willing to give in the impure case. So you're not seeing any crowding. OK, so here is probably where I'll spend a few minutes to conclude this talk in terms of the evidence, but I think it's sort of the real kicker to this project. What we did was we are going to jointly estimate both the time and money. So we're going to simultaneously get this because we know these decisions are going to be correlated. We're going to control for, and I'll explain the crowding out in a second, we're going to control for the price of money. So in this case, this is just the match. Okay, we're going to control for the price to give time. This is going to have to do with how it affects your taxes. This is going to be your private wage, because this is the opportunity cost. So this is going to be this the single value of the price to give for all of our different conditions. And we also have, we're going to control for their potential income. So this would be if you kept all your money for yourself and you worked entirely for yourself. Okay, so there's different levels of these. Okay, so to estimate the crowding effects, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the case where there's zero tax to the case where there is a tax, a positive tax that goes to the charity. And we're going to say full crowding would occur if they changed the amount of money they gave to the charity such that the resulting amount to the organization would be unchanged. That would be 100%. That would make this be negative 100%, or this would be negative 100%, or if you add these two up, that it adds up to negative 100% in terms of how much they change their behavior. What we see in terms of the impure condition is there's no effect. It's very close to a true zero here in terms of how it affects their monetary donations based on this crowding variable. And that's true for both their time and money. In the case of the pure condition, where we've tried to focus their attention on the value of the charity, what we're seeing is this very large significant effect. 60% reduction in the amount of the money they're giving, where 100% reduction would have led to full crowding out. 15% in the time donations. Okay, you add those up, it's 75%. So the amount of money that's going to the charity, only 25% of that remains as additional amount to the charity. 75% is just being crowded out by this change in behavior. There's also another recent paper out that's actually a working paper. I haven't seen the final version of it. They're finding almost identical types of results here in terms of the difference between crowding out of money and crowding out of time, where you're seeing a much larger effect for money than for time. And we think that's pretty sensible if you think about impure motives. The impure motives is what's causing you not to get crowded out. The impure motives we think are going to be stronger for voluntary activities than for money. Okay? All right, so the next one is this based on the match, so the price to give money. So we had 50% and 100%. So if you want to think about giving $1 to the charity, if it's a 100% match, you only have to give 50 cents. If it's a 50% match, you have to give 67 cents. So that's the variation here we're looking at. If we look at both the impure and the pure cases, what we're seeing is that in terms of money, it's not surprising. It's getting more expensive to give money. You're seeing a negative significant effect, fairly dramatic effect in terms of giving less money. You see that both in case of the impure and the pure case. In addition, what you see is this effect is much larger. So again, this is because in the pure case, the only thing you care about is the money going to the organization. This money is coming through the match. We're changing the match. You're going to see this bigger effect there. Here's something that's really interesting. I should have said this. All the stuff that's in green, these are things I'm highlighting that were predicted from our theoretical model. We didn't have predictions here. We didn't have predictions for these other areas. They're interesting results, but we didn't have predictions from the theory. The thing that's really important here is the following. We see that they're reducing, when we increase the price to give money, they're reducing the amount of giving of money. And we might say, OK, we can now sort of set a sense of policy assessment that says, yeah, this giving, if we raise the price, or if we put this in the opposite direction, if we increase the match, we're going to generate more money in terms of money being given. Okay? But there's this cross price. There's this substitution effect that's going on. And what's happening is when as the price of giving money goes up, they're giving less money, but they're also now giving more time. And in other words, if we ignore the effect on time decisions, how much you volunteer, we'd be overstating, and in this case, fairly dramatically, these are pretty big effects, we'd be fairly dramatically overestimating the effect of the match. So what's happening is we're not capturing the full effects by only looking at the match on the money donations, which is, I think it's really important, because the literature tends to do this, and has, I think, for the most part, maybe other than the papers here today, has been ignoring this substitution that's going on across other ways we give. In terms of the endowment, this is not surprising. Probably fall out of, we didn't need our model to do this, probably fall out of most models. What we're finding is, as you raise people's income, the income effect is that they give both more in terms of money, but also in terms of time. Again, if you looked at endowment effects and you'd only focused on this, you'd underestimate the effect of the endowment. Okay, and that's true in both the pure and the impure. Okay, so let me make two summary slides here. The first thing I think is really important is we've defined a shadow price, or a price to measure the scale of impurity. We think this is really important to get a sense of how big this impurity is in a quantitative sense. Second thing we think is really important is, particularly for lab studies, but we also think in terms of policy and organizations, we can frame, thanks, that'll be great. We can frame the way we provide information to potential donors in a way that can focus their attention on their impure or pure motives. And what we're finding is when we frame on the pure motives, we're going to get a more efficient choice. They're going to allocate their time and money more efficiently from the point of view of the charity, but it's going to come at an overall cost of less money that's being donated. Okay, we find crowding effects were larger when we frame in the pure. That's what's causing the overall less charitable giving. We find donations of money and time are substitutes. Okay, and the more pure your motives are, the more we're going to see these substitution effects. This implies that any estimated effect on policy, for example, a tax, the matches, we're going to overestimate the effects. We're not the first to talk about, this paper is the first to talk about these substitution effects between giving, when you have a manipulation of a policy. There are a few other papers that have done this. I think we're the first maybe that's done this in a sort of more systematic, formal, rigorous with models to go with this. I've done work where we looked at charitable organizations, we looked at first and second donations, and we found that when a second donation was being collected by a church, it was reducing the amount of money that was going to the first donation. We've done work with blood drives in a number of countries now. We find that if you offer an incentive to donate at one location, you get a very big effect there, but that's way overestimating the effect because we find that people are substituting away from donating at other locations where there aren't incentives. And we also find that there's a short-term reduction in donations afterwards. And then there's a nice paper, I haven't seen the final version, by Olivier Armentier. He presented this at ESA last year. And he finds that when you offer a match to potential donors, you see a positive effect of that. But if you call them a week later for a donation, people who had been offered the match versus people who hadn't, a week later when you call them, you're actually seeing less donations that are occurring for those that had been offered the match. So there's, again, this substitution of giving. In terms of discussion, one thing I think is really important here for our study is we've probably dramatically, even though we find these strong effects of the impure motives, we've probably dramatically underestimated them in our lab study. If we think of impure motives as forms of signaling, if we think about them as the social aspects of donating, that you get to work with other people, you get to be with people, if you think about volunteering where you might enjoy the task differently than your normal work, we may be very much underestimating these impure motives as what's driving behavior, and we still get these fairly large impure motives. We think charities, in some sense, have it right, because most charities do focus on the impure motives. They do thank you for your time. They do thank you for the money you give. I've seen some examples to the contrary, but it's pretty rare to see a charity that says, gee, thank you, you've generated, 5 meals. Or, well, that's a bad example, because that's where you do see this. But you rarely see that you said, you've generated something that was worth $100 to us, as opposed to it's what you gave us. It's sort of the normal way. The last thing I'll say is we think policies targeted to assist charities, so we're now thinking more from a government perspective, we think they'd be more effective if they target charities whose donors are motivated more by impure motives than pure motives. So if we could find organizations and we could measure what is driving their motivations to give, then we think that this would give us an avenue to think about how more effectively to use policy tools to motivate giving without having crowding effects, without having substitution effects. And with a little bit of humor, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank the organization for funding this conference. And it's also nice that you improve the quality of our work with comments and suggestions if you have any.
Questions? Yeah, well, I'm fascinated by this process of impurity and subtleties of the treatment are a separate issue that we would have about those. Here's my concern. The concern is that you're saying if you didn't work, Glenn, if you didn't give time to the donor, to the charity, you could work and earn some money and give them more money, and that would be more valuable to the charity. But then your quote-unquote pure treatment says, what I'm doing now, I'm not allocating my time, I'm giving significantly less time. So the concern is, doesn't that suggest that when I go back to my regular day job and allocate time there to the charity, I give it 3 minutes instead of 3 hours? I mean, isn't that logically implied by your design? Because you can't actually do that counterfactually.
I'm not sure I follow the question, I guess. I might be.
That we did the shuttered price of the
Yeah.
insurance, it was key insight. I don't understand how that's actually done.
Okay, so actually, it's really important. It's relevant to the experiment. That's a mechanical tool. The reason you can't do this normally outside the lab is because we don't observe exactly what people's wages are. We don't, their marginal tax. There's a lot of information we wouldn't observe. In the lab, the way we do this is very mechanical. I just observe your choice. I know the exact condition. I know what the wage was. I know what the tax rate was. I know what was happening with the tax rate. Okay? I then observe your choice. You said, I want to give 20 minutes of time and I want to give $6. I go through the mechanics. I figure exactly how much money. So this is independent of anything else. I go through, I can figure out that generated $11 to the charitable organization. Okay, then I can look and I can say, well, there are other ways we can allocate their time and money to have generated that exact same $11 based on that same wage, same tax rate, same match, and so forth. Okay? And then I say, look, I found another way they could have given the identical amount, and it only would cost them $7. Right? And no. They just no. They're gonna work for themselves. They have this 40-minute time. They either work. They're going to lick envelopes and sign these envelopes regardless. They're going to do that regardless. They just have to decide: is it 20 minutes for the charity, 20 for themselves? Is it 40 for themselves? 0 for them for the charity, 10 for the. They just choose how they. But they're going to do the exact same task regardless. Okay.
Maybe one more question while Jonathan gets ready to go with our next talk. One more. I'll ask you a quick question then.
Okay.
With these normative implications you have, it's nice to see work that tries to have normative implications. Do you have a thought about whether a social policymaker should have preferences over warm glow? Peter Diamond has this old journal Public Economics paper where he kind of weighs the pros and cons of that. You kind of make it, you're taking a stand on that, really, I would say.
I am, but I guess what we're arguing is it's essentially cost-free. We're saying if you're going to impose a policy that's going to create, from, let's say, a tax policy, this is what we look at, a tax policy that's going to give money to a charitable organization, do it in a context where they're being motivated by warm glow. If we can identify these contexts where they're motivated more by warm glow than pure, it won't affect their warm glow, but it will affect how much they give, because it won't crowd out that giving. So we think it's essentially cost-free to do. So I'm not sure there's a normative in that sense.
Yeah, I hear you. All right, thanks, Bob, very much.